Thanks everyone for joining us for the last meeting of the Social Wealth Seminar in 2020. Today we are very lucky to have with us Sarah Quinn, who will be speaking to the topic, How Credit Programs Became a Multi-Purpose Political Tool. Before we get into the meat of the session, I would like to just say a couple preliminary words. First, the Social Wealth Seminar is an ongoing virtual semi-monthly forum exploring strategies to manage public assets and resources in service of a more just society in the US and across the world. We've been meeting since the middle of this past year every 2 weeks to learn from scholars, activists, officials who are engaged in different ways with these core questions. And the seminar is hosted by the Jane Family Institute, or JFI, and we're an applied research organization in the social sciences based in New York City with a focus on digital ethics, higher education finance, and guaranteed income. For those who don't know me, my name is Paul Katz, and I am VP of Special Projects at JFI, and of course help to organize this seminar series. So today, as always, we'll begin with a presentation, which will be followed by lots of time for questions and discussion. So if you have substantive questions, I'll ask please save them for the end of the meeting when we can discuss them together. If, however, you have a question that's more like a point of clarification, feel free to put it in the chat, and then Sarah can opt to address it or not as she prefers. I should also note that we are recording this session and we'll be posting a lightly edited version to our YouTube channel for those who can't make it. So if you don't want to appear incidentally, please make sure that your camera is not activated. So just to close these comments, a couple quick thanks. As always, I am indebted to JFI's editorial department, especially Hala Ahmad, our PR and policy communications lead, and Molly Dektar, our editorial director. Of course, extremely grateful to Sarah for joining us, and to all of you for being here today. All right, so now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Quinn. Sarah Quinn is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Washington. She uses historical research and case studies to investigate the intersection of political institutions, market practices, and systems of moralization. She is co-chair of the Washington chapter of the Scholar Strategy Network and is a faculty affiliate of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and Urban at UW. Quinn's ongoing work looks at the development of federal credit programs, the complexity of US political institutions, and the moral classification of human lives and bodies. Her research has been funded by the Institute of New Economic Thinking and published in the American Journal of Sociology, Sociological Theory, and other venues. Quinn has previously held fellowships at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies and the Michigan Society of Fellows. She has a BA in sociology from Smith College and an MA and PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. So now it is my tremendous honor to pass the baton to Sarah. Please take it away.
Thank you, and I'm going to share my screen. Is that all right? Together.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Is that coming through okay?
Absolutely.
So I'm a shameless and veteran name changer of talks. I don't think I have once in my entire career managed to give a talk with the title that I had sent along. As I was doing my final preparations for this, I realized that actually for this group, I would focus more on the political side and the theory side rather than go deep into the history. Though, of course, I'm always happy to talk history. So if there are questions, we can really do that in Q&A. But for today's talk, I want to talk about some of the politics of the credit programs. So usually I spend a little bit more time than I probably will in this group talking about what a credit program is. The credit programs buy and sell, insure and guarantee, and otherwise work to promote lending and direct credit towards desired political goals. Today, the US government holds about 1.5 trillion in loans. Those are mostly school loans, and guarantees another 2.8 trillion. This is a chart from the Federal Credit Supplement. These are on budget numbers. If you add the off budget numbers, you're going to be closer to 4 trillion, a lot of which is has to do with how Fannie Mae is being accounted for on the budget. Then when I introduce the federal credit programs, what I like to point out is we should be thinking of them not just in terms of the fact that there's this network of programs through which the government is moving credit around and kind of generating credit in the economy, but that these are institution builders. And some institutions in our economy that we take for granted as having, many people may take for granted as having come solely from private initiative, have a very important history of government support through these credit facilities. It is the Export-Import Bank that really pioneered mid-sized overseas business loans in the United States. Banks did not do that until Export-Import Bank demonstrated its profitability. The early venture capital industry received important supports from the Small Business Administration. Famously, the FHA popularized the long-term amortized home mortgage. It was actually following the lead of the farm loan system, which had already done that for agricultural loans. And Fannie Mae was very important in the history of mortgage securitization and the rise of the securitization market. Actually where my research in the credit programs began, trying to figure out why and how the government was doing this business. If we're thinking about the credit programs today, the first thing that might come to your mind is the Paycheck Protection Program. One of the kind of classic uses the government has for credit support is as an emergency function. And we're seeing that happen right now. The Small Business Administration actually is housing, I think, 4 separate forms of credit support right now. The most famous one is this Paycheck Protection Program. Actually starts, it was an adaptation of an existing government program that used guarantees for small business loans, where the government was guaranteeing loans through banks to help small business. And that is really kind of a classic federal credit program. So really the government can use credit programs to do all sorts of things. And when we're thinking about these programs, it's a mistake just to think about them as being primarily about market needs. And the reason for that is really going to be the focus of the rest of the talk. But the government uses federal credit programs for all sorts of things. It is a form of foreign policy. The US government has provided support for other nations' sovereign debt. It is a form of climate disaster policy. It's through loan forgiveness and mortgage insurance that FEMA does a lot of support for markets after crises. There are all sorts of ways that these loans get used. So much of my research has been about why and how government officials use credit as a tool of statecraft, recognizing that credit allocation and credit policies are kind of one tool of many government officials have, and there are reasons they like to use it. In the larger book that this talk is drawing from, I actually start at the founding era of the US and go through the 1970s to make the argument that US lawmakers have repeatedly turned to property ownership and easy credit in a search that was elusive ultimately for economic opportunities that come with minimal political conflict. And when I'm saying conflict here, I mean political kind of public controversy, but also in the more minute form of veto points, right? Like highly localized political conflict in political institutions, or open wealth distribution. And I'm happy to talk about the larger argument. But how this works and why credit works for that is what I'm going to turn to next. Studying credit programs as they've unfolded in many different ways from the founding era to the 1970s, what became very clear to me is that credit has, as a political tool, had a capacity for what I call politicalness. And that political lightness makes it useful in a lot of different potential ways. And that usefulness creates an incentive for government officials to define all sorts of social problems as problems of credit allocation so that then they can use this very handy tool to solve it. So let me tell you what I mean by political lightness. First of all, credit programs are ideologically flexible. They have what I call a classificatory ambiguity. Let me explain what I mean by this. When government officials are faced with a political problem, say somebody is asking, constituents are asking for better access to higher education because the importance of higher education credentials have increased in society, or a rural area needs more medical care. And they don't have money to build a hospital, but there's a need for a hospital. If the government can come in and offer a loan to a private company to do it, or a loan for a private company to build that hospital, or even better, a guarantee loan to a private company to build that hospital, it's not so hard to line up people on different sides of the political spectrum around that. On the left, what you have is the government getting something done and kind of government stepping in. And on the right, you have a way of being able to talk about this as being the market. Now, sometimes this kind of ideological appeal of credit programs gets talked about as if people just kind of can't see the government because it's the market. And I don't want to dispute that that sometimes happens, that people don't necessarily always understand when they're getting when they're benefiting from credit support that the government's been involved. But I do like to point out that ultimately, I think it's most powerful, not because it's invisible, but because it can be interpreted in different ways by different people. Because it can kind of be everything to everyone, which politicians love, right? It allows them to speak out of both sides of their mouth. And if we're talking about this in academic terms, we can talk about this as classificatory ambiguity, or it being polysemic, or in sociology, a theory of robust action that can be interpreted in multiple ways. Credit programs also have what I call a fiscal lightness. By that I mean they can have really big payoffs for relatively low outlays. This can work in a couple of different ways. One, think about the school loan programs, if the government is issuing a loan, that loan is getting repaid back with interest. And if those are viable loans, the government is going to make a profit off of the long term. So this can be a good deal, a good investment. With the guarantee, you have an even bigger bang for your buck in the sense that the federal government can guarantee a loan for a private company or for a homeowner, as in the case with FHA. And if that is an actuarially sound loan, then the government never needs to pay. Sociologically, what's happening actually is that the symbolic power of the government, all the power of the government's reputation as a creditor, is being transferred to specific people. And that, that doesn't cost them money, but it can be highly effective. There's a different capacity of the credit programs that I separate out from the fiscal capacity that I talked about as budgetary. And this has to do with the kind of realm of accounting and the realm of budget politics, so not looking at kind of the overall costs, but how costs are reported and how they move through the political system. Credit programs are relatively easy to set up off budget or through public-private partnerships. They've also historically for a long time were set up as these revolving accounts. Credit reporting itself wasn't actually modernized till the 1990s. And one of the things that I continually ran into studying the history of these programs is that they were almost a black box of what was happening within them. There was actually one report from 1978 from the CBO where they were trying to figure out how much money the government had lost through loan forgiveness in these programs. And they concluded that it could not be calculated because the data simply didn't exist. Everything was being held totally in each office under different assumptions. This gave government officials a lot of leeway. But even today, what we see is that there's still ways of the government kind of using budgetary gimmicks or getting it off the books in ways that make these programs attractive. And in this way, they can have the appeal the same way that tax expenditures do. Be easier to pass and kind of get around budget limits. The last way that I talk about credit programs as light in the book is in a racial sense, that there's a long history of the federal credit programs reproducing racial hierarchies and benefiting disproportionately white families. And this matters as a really specific part of the US political system, the kinds of problems that if we look, for example, at the New Deal, and when you see the Southern Democrats forming a bloc in the kind of Katz-Nelson story, forming a bloc to prevent the expansion of welfare programs, they don't do that with the credit programs. Why aren't they doing that with the credit programs? In part because credit markets, private credit markets, aren't exactly radical institutions. They can be pretty much counted on to reproduce the status quo. So these kind of blocks of kind of racial divides and white racism that can stop other kinds of programs have not been a problem with the credit programs, in part because of the way credit markets can reproduce racial hierarchies. So all of this helps us understand something like the student loan programs. So, right? In this example that I brought up before, if there's a question of why and how you're going to solve the problem of promoting education, and you're a government official or a group of government officials trying to figure it out, you can use loans and guarantees rather than build schools or directly provide grants to fund private education. And the student loan programs are interesting, and I think it's interesting to think about with this group, and in a lot of ways, because I know that JFI has been involved in these debates. But when you look at the history of student loans, actually for a lot of their history, they're following this trajectory that a lot of the other programs are, which is they start as direct loan programs, and very quickly you see them moving into guarantees, because in the post-war era, the guarantees are able to be completely taken off budget. And they're one of the few programs that move from a guarantee program back to a direct loan program. And the timing of that is revealing. That happens after there's modernization in the 1990s, and that these programs can be accounted for in terms of a capital budget. Before that, the entire loan would have counted as an outlay on the year it was issued. In the history of student loans, what we see is that paying attention to the budget politics and to the political lightness of credit helps us understand why credit programs are being used, and also the form sometimes that those specific programs are taking. In the book, I talk about how there are many implications of this. There are direct political trade-offs. On one hand, it's not clear that some programs would happen without some kind of forms of support would have happened in US history without using these credit forms. But they have real trade-offs. They have trade-offs in transparency. All the budget problems mean that it's hard, sometimes they've been like literally erased from our most important accounts of what the government does. These public-private partnerships introduce problems with coordination. We saw this all over the place with the Paycheck Protection Program, and can cause problems with control. They are a hugely important part of the developmental state, the welfare state, how we think of inequality, financial power, household debt, instability, and crisis. So in general, what I'm trying to argue is that as part of when we're thinking about, I look at the history of US political economy. When we're thinking about the history of the US political economy, we should be thinking about these programs what they do. When we're thinking about what are the lessons for this? When we're thinking about the credit programs, we should be thinking about it, I believe, and kind of asking two main sets of questions. One, what do we want credit to be? What do we want to be using credit to do or to not do? When do we want to use these programs and these tools, and when do we not? There's a lot of talking points and very popular talking points about them as solving market inefficiencies, but they're often being used not because they solve market inefficiencies, but because government officials like them, and then having liked them, they're going to define a problem like how to provide for higher education as a credit problem to justify using the tool. So as academics, as researchers, as policymakers, and concerned citizens, we want to be thinking past that rhetoric and be thinking about kind of when and how we want to be using credit, which is a really actually deeper question about what is the role of finance in political economy? To what extent are we saying that when people need to get their needs met, and especially when we start talking about needs like healthcare and education and housing, how much should those needs hinge on credit markets? And if they're hinging on credit markets, how much should they hinge on private credit markets versus public facilities? The second question I think we should ask has to do with not this big question of where do we want credit and finance to fit into the political economy, but what actual deals are we setting up? What exchanges and contracts are we using? And what are the terms, and are those terms fair? When we're using credit as a policy tool, what terms can we use to make it more equitable and sustainable for borrowers? And when I talk about sustainability, I mean both on the level of the family. Are we giving loans to people and helping people get loans in ways that allow families to really build and do well over time? Or are we setting families up for financial disaster and extractive financial capitalism? So how do we kind of make it? And then I think of equitability and sustainability also on these kind of broad levels. Are we providing credit support for green businesses? I mean, these are kind of questions that take us into questions like the Green New Deal. So what are the terms that these loans are being done on, and how are they setting up? Those are the other kind of sets of questions we should ask. In a given loan, on any given credit program, who gets the profits and who gets the risks, and is that division fair? Because if that division is not fair, what you get is a system of socialized risks and privatized profits, sometimes on highly extractive terms for families. And I'm pretty sure in this room, this is not the system we want. So I'll stop there. So we have time for the Q&A. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. It was a really fantastic presentation to kind of put some of the major themes from, I think, your spectacular book on the table. And I guess what I really appreciated about the presentation in particular was this concept of the political lightness of credit, which is also just a great phrase. But I think one that kind of can lead us away from what you articulated in the first sentence of the book, which is really what won me over, this idea that finance is always social. And I guess I don't feel like we talk about credit for the most part in those terms, even though the word itself actually seems to imply a relationship among people and kind of a judgment about their nature. So I mean, I'm just so grateful for the presentation and so eager for the discussion. So as is our habit, there are multiple ways that people can ask questions. If someone would like to ask a question and appear on camera, which would be ideal if you're comfortable with it, you can just indicate in the chat that you have a question, and then you can turn on your camera and introduce yourself and ask it. But alternatively, if you would prefer not to appear, you can type your whole question in the chat, or send it directly to me, and just let me know that you'd like to be anonymous, and then I can read it out. So as always, I have some questions myself that I jotted in advance of the session, and then during the presentation. I'm happy to ask some, but of course I've already done a lot of talking. So if anyone has a question ready and would like to jump in, you can just indicate that in the chat. I'll wait a couple seconds. Okay, so I'm just going to go for it. I'll ask a question, and as I'm doing that, please, if you're putting a question together, let me know in the chat. You know, you can just indicate it there. So as we were talking about, Sarah, kind of before we began, you know, my own background is in history. Still plugging away at the dissertation myself. But so I was, you know, so excited by the really far-ranging historical perspective of your book, and I guess I was just kind of interested now to ask, you know, what do you think changes about how we understand the history of credit programs in the United States, or rather the political function of credit programs in the United States, by tracing them back historically to kind of the creation of the Republic, instead of, as seems to often be the case, say starting, you know, in the post-war period of the 20th century. Sort of what comes into clearer focus as a result of that longue durée perspective?
That's a great question. You know, to start to answer it, I'll say what had happened. Here's how I really ended up going so far back in US history. Is at a certain point, I realized I'd been saying a bunch of things that were wrong. I'd been wrong in a consistent way, which is I kept on saying things were new that weren't. Now, historians will laugh. I was a sociologist, so this is how I became. Sometimes I joke that I'm an accidental political economist and an accidental historical political economist, but I didn't want to be wrong. So I had to learn the history to understand what was new. And then as I learned the history, what I saw were that these patterns really persist over time. The first thing is it's important to kind of go back, not even just to the 19th century, but before the New Deal. That actually a lot of the action of figuring out the credit programs starts to happen with the Farm Loan Act, which reorganizes the entire farm loan system from the bottom up and has a massive educational campaign to create the farm loan system that we have today. And that's important because one of the things we realize is as soon as we get a modern government in the United States, we get credit programs. This is always a part of it. So one of the things we see about the credit programs is sometimes it's talked about as things that happen elsewhere, like developmental states do that, but the US doesn't have a developmental state. So what we see is that the US does have a developmental state, and it was always a part of it. But the really important thing that we start to see from that moment, and that we can see even further back, is responding to the fractured political institutions. And this is the thing that I talk a lot about in the book, though it's only kind of hinted at in the presentation I just gave. So one of the reasons that kind of generation after generation of government on the left and on the right seems to discover this as a very effective policy tool is they're often responding to the same thing, which is veto points and kind of deep political fractures and political problems. And then they figure out that using credit will provide a way forward or a kind of solution. And they don't necessarily know or understand the history of it as they're doing it. They often will know about another program, but they don't really have a sense of the programs altogether or as a system that kind of keeps reoccurring. What you can see from going back even further, though, is that even you can see these pressures being issues at other points in US history. And you see moments where it works kind of at an ad hoc basis on a smaller level in the 19th century. So you see it with the railroads. I actually start with the land offices, with the US government, with the kind of national government in Washington selling land to raise, in a failed attempt to raise money to pay off Revolutionary War debt. What you see is that this has always been an issue, that they've always figured out that like land and credit are useful political tools. At other moments in US history, though, government involvement in credit is so explosive and controversial that it really only peeks through, because most of the time groups are able to stop it. It's what changes in the 19th century, what changes, I argue, actually around organization around the Farm Loan Act, and some things leading up to that from the populists, is that the idea that it's acceptable and okay for the government to be involved in credit in this way.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's very exciting to me to see again such a broad chronological scope, and to be arguing for the importance of decisions taken 150 years ago. I mean, you don't have to convince me, so it's very exciting
Yeah.
to be reading. Well, I see now that questions are starting to come in here. Alec, would you like to ask yours?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah, for a great talk. I'm curious, many of the examples and some of the elements of how you describe the functioning of political likeness, things like veto points, seem to me at least to be kind of bound up with the scale and the specifics of a federal and specifically a sovereign government. And I'm curious if you could say a bit how you might expect some of those ideas to play out at smaller scales, like at a municipal or a state scale.
Yes, so it's a great question. It's funny, I was actually halfway through your question, I was like, oh, it's the international question. No,
the other direction. That's right.
Both of which are important, neither of which I really take on in the book. So I've got to change my brain because my brain, like the train, like left the station. I'm like, well, in fact, if you look at what the EU is doing today, you see very similar patterns. On the subnational, we do have some examples of this, and actually, very effective work on this is Josh Pushevitz's work on tax increment finance and on the importance of how that's played out as kind of financialization of subnational governments. There are different systems on the kind of, obviously it works differently on the national and subnational level, and a lot of it has to do with ability to borrow and what you need to borrow. But we do see this kind of, I would argue, a similar, in guarantees of bonds, a similar transfer of kind of the symbolic power of the state that can happen at the subnational level. But really, it's an area that I have not studied much. I'll say, with the exception of the 19th century, when all the action is happening on pretty much a lot of the action is happening on the subnational level, and then you have the states acting as little development banks, and using these systems while using kind of credit programs extensively. But I haven't systematically looked at all at the subnational level in the U.S. But I think a lot of the core principles of like thinking about how and when people engage with finance, government officials engage with finance, because of the ways that it allows them to use their power to kind of escape limitations, holds up. The other way you see it, I will say that it's a similar logic. One of the things I argue in the book is we should also be thinking about these credit programs as part of a style of statecraft that also includes public-private partnerships, generally turning to markets. That these, as a group, are a whole set of ways that government officials have learned to kind of cope with U.S. political institutions and the fractured nature of it.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Great. So I believe we have some questions from Steve Waldman.
Hi, here, let me make myself visible. So first of all, I want to thank you for that really wonderful presentation. I need to read your book now, but you touch a lot of themes so close to my heart. So I want to gush a little bit. It was fantastic. I had a very narrow presentation, a very narrow question, and then a broader one. So the very narrow question is, are you including in your definition of credit programs FDIC?
I don't really talk about them so much as the credit. I don't get into them deeply into the book, but I would argue that, yeah, that once we're in insurance, you can account that.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it interesting.
There's a whole bunch of things that I think are kind of in gray areas that straddle. I also kind of like keep at an arm's distance what's happening in the Fed. So when I'm thinking of traditional credit programs, like the ones that I'm often looking at are ones where the government is directly giving loans or guaranteeing loans, as opposed to insuring accounts. But we get into similar kinds of ways of thinking about the economy.
Yeah, very much. So one way of thinking of FDIC is that it's a guarantee of depositors' loans,
Yeah.
right? So it is quite close, but it would make your numbers, I think, a lot bigger if you if you did include that.
Well, the numbers, if you actually include like all the ways, I mean, the fact, take away what money is, like we can think about like what money is at all, but like the numbers, if you look at all the ways that the government is supporting the economy, it is like 2/3. That like you get into a completely different sphere.
Right, order of magnitude. And then my broader question is, when you talk about the political lightness of credit programs, which I think is a really wonderful way to put things and captures a lot, and I love the four ways that you subdivide it, and adding the racial to that is sort of non-obvious and interesting. So I think that was great. But is it an alchemical dissipation of political weight, or should we think of it as kind of a maturity transformation of political weight? Meaning that we make things politically light at the time that we do them, but there's one story, a story that I'm fond of, that says sort of finance is a way that we sort of paper over a lot of conflicts, but there's a significant likelihood of their coming home to roost someday. So is there a kind of meta accounting for political weight that might include sort of an accrual accounting of political weight that we might want to think about?
I haven't thought about it in that way, but I will say like what you just said is pretty much what I think, which is like well, let me take a step back. On one hand, I think it's both. I guess what I would say is I think it's both. And it depends on what kinds of things we're talking about and how and why credit's used. I think there are really important ways that we have to recognize the government is always a part of how economies grow. That states and markets, that big capitalist markets are projects that involve state and private actors working together over long periods of time, and the government and credit facilities are part of how this happens. And this is not just a story of developmental states that kind of as a stage people go through in some kind of ground way, but actually this like completely persists over time, and that we can and should be thinking about our financial sector as a public utility, and that the government can and should be involved in, and that some of these transfers are part of a normal and appropriate and very good ways that economies work, and we don't need to apologize about it or be embarrassed about it because we have some laissez-faire fantasy that all of this is somehow going to happen without a government. So in that sense, it's a kind of, maybe more of a kind of alchemical thing. Now, that said, to the extent that there are functions that of core basic needs that don't necessarily have to or should be financial in nature, like I would argue school and housing, healthcare, and we're using finance to paper over, that bill does come due. So I would say, like, I would distinguish between true, real infrastructural development and appropriate ways of the government being involved in a healthy financial system, and an overreaching use of financial system to avoid wealth distribution when it's needed.
That sounds great and very sensible. Thank you so much. It was a really wonderful talk, and I look forward to your book.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so we've actually received a question via the chat, which I've been asked to read, which asks if you could please highlight some specific features of our social structure beyond race that have made credit creation via state support essential to the economy.
All right, so the first example of features, so I'm not sure I totally understand the question, so I'm going to answer the question the way I understand it.
Wonderful.
Use, like, speaker's prerogative. There's like there's multiple ways I could think about that question, and one question is, what are social divides besides racial divides that credit is being used or has been used to manage? And the big story of that in US history and through the 19th century, in addition to race, is farmers and agriculture and the kind of settlement of the country. So and I will say that I have a tendency, this is my tendency, because my real expertise is the founding era to founding era to 1970s, I will ask everybody's forgiveness for how old some of my answers will be. But so much of the story of kind of the settlement of the country gets told as if everybody just has money and the ability to just kind of move around and settle down. But in fact, what we know is that the land is being taken and appropriated and then reused as a political tool. We know that there's a really fascinating and important work by Kay-Sue Park on the use of mortgages themselves as an extractive instrument of colonialism, that like the mortgage is used by settlers to take the land. That we know from Frymer's work that the US government is releasing land as part of a military effort strategically in order to move population where it wants to fight against Native peoples and kind of at the Mexican border, or kind of to take over Mexico. So you have all the ways it's being used for that. And then you have also credit being used in different ways to appease settlers, to appease soldiers, to appease farmers. So you have a lot of these stories and kind of in different ways. Now, today we might think about it in a contemporary example of how credit, again, like if I go back to the school loans examples, what you see with them is the school loan programs start as a Cold War era kind of response to Sputnik. We are going to be outfought by the Soviets on science, makes a leap under Johnson to war against poverty. You can use credit to try to help bring people up and fight poverty, and then becomes a middle class entitlement. So we can think of it just even in that one program, kind of multiple groups being kind of brought in and kind of politically appeased. But anytime you're using this, anytime credit programs are being used, it's common with farmers today, it's common in rural areas today. There's no sector of our economy. Let me answer it this way. There is no sector of our economy that at some point has not received credit support. And there's no group that is not at some ways affected by it or can be affected by it. So if anybody who is living in a coastal area that can afford those homes because in areas that are likely to have kind of catastrophic environmental losses because of they're too close to the water, is dealing in the realm of kind of federal credit support.
Great. Well, thank you. I think those answers that align with the very plausible interpretation of the question you've offered are excellent. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I see we have a question from Amanda. Would you like to jump in?
Hi. Sure, I'll jump in. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have read part of your book and really enjoy your work. And my question's a little in the weeds of academia, but I'm curious, like I was struck by kind of your thinking about your book and the work you presented in conversation with some of the scholarly work on financialization. Especially the academic work tells the story of financialization is kicking off in the latter part of the 20th century, but your work seems to really point out that actually the history may be much longer. And then I was also struck by your answer to the previous question when you said that, perhaps we should be thinking of the financial sector as like a public utility. And I think that a lot of the academic work doesn't seem to focus on the role of the state in financialization. So I'm curious of like how you see your work fitting in with other financialization scholarship, like is it, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
That's a great question. I love that question. So one of the things that I do believe is that there is a tendency to over-attribute things today to neoliberalism and financialization that have deeper roots. I absolutely do think that's happening. not to say that there isn't a real change that happened in the 1970s, there is, but we have a tendency, because we think, to the extent that we're thinking of things like securitization as really being about now, we're not paying attention to how it happens and the role it played in the 1920s, and then again in the 1860s, and also maybe in the 1830s. And we stop ourselves from looking at these longer trends if we just assume some of these things are newer than they are. So I'm glad to hear you took that from the book, because it is a thing that I believe. In terms of the academic conversation, you know, I'm kind of coming at it from this funny corner of that conversation, which is in sociology, where actually the question I usually get in rooms of sociologists is, well, we already know this is all about the state, because this is the Krippner story. So it is true. So it's funny, like I come at it from this place of kind of assuming the government's going to be involved in different ways and wanting to understand. But that is not, in fact, the dominant story elsewhere, necessarily. And it's often the role of the state, especially in popular accounts, gets written out. So an example I sometimes use is, again, the history of securitization. If you watch The Big Short or something like Moneyball, you really think like Louis Ranieri on his own just invented this thing and made it happen and made a lot of money, and like not the fact that the US government had been working consistently for 2 decades at that point to make sure that that market happened, and had been using it privately for decades before. So the role of the government does get like written out of these stories, and I want on a more general level to write it in. I will say, and this is not exactly what you asked, but I will say that part of what I think is, in terms of how I write about it or how I think about writing it, so it has to do with my own personal background. So I was a sociology major as an undergrad, and then I graduated and wanted to live in New York City. And I took the first job through a headhunter in New York City that would allow me to afford an apartment in Manhattan. And that was in the credit department of a derivatives firm, which is how I've ended up studying all of this. And I spent 5 years there, and I learned an incredible amount. But it was because of that experience that I wasn't afraid that I knew this was important, this kind of stuff was important, and I wasn't afraid to study it. But I think the other thing that I think is important for academics to think about, or that I certainly think about, is how do we write about it and talk about it in ways that demystify some of these things that are happening? And how do we, that there is a power struggle that is ongoing about who gets to talk about and make authoritative claims about finance and how it should be run and who should get to do it. And I do think it's important to be having people from a lot of disciplines as part of that conversation. And I do think, while I certainly don't think everybody has to write about it in a way that's accessible to a public audience, because I think a lot of great, important academic work isn't, and I have no desire for it all to be, I also do think there is a place for finding times and ways to do that. And, as I worked on this, I would spend time sitting down and listening to a giant pool of money to see rhetorically how they were doing it. What kind of metaphors are they using? How do they talk about these things in ways that actually get the point across without dumbing it down? So I think that's the other kind of part about how I think about myself fitting into it academically, is I do try to use the tools of sociology to demystify some of these things.
Thanks, that's such a lovely answer. I'm curious a little bit then, if you think do you think using the term financialization, should we think of that as referring specifically to developments within finance starting in the 1970s, or do you think the term is we need to broaden the time horizon of how we think about financialization, so it isn't just dated to kicking off in the 70s?
Oh, I haven't thought about it that way. I think in part because I do kind of buy the Krippner story of something does change in the 70s, but what changes is not, and maybe, so I think there could be a bunch of possible, all right, I think there could be a couple of possible answers. I'm going to go full academic in my answer and do an on the one hand, on the other hand. I can see multiple possible ways of solving this problem. The question is how do we talk about these trends that we're seeing and the roles that they're having in the world without erasing our past? And one way is to help people understand what those terms mean. Yes, we can use financialization as a tool to help us understand. I mean, And when I think of it as this phase, I think of it in terms of Krippner, who's using a regime, like who's thinking about this as cyclical and would have this historical sense that it's always there. One way is to help people understand that when we're talking about financialization, we're talking not about a new era of finance, but a reorganizing of how finance fits in and of the rules around finance, and and that the role of finance shifts as we are kind of with this neoliberalism taking away these other things that counterbalance it. So we could help people understand the terms better, or maybe there is a better different term. I do not have it. I haven't thought like what would I call it instead. I often think, I guess, on that first phrase but it's a really similar debate. I mean, I do think about this a lot with neoliberalism, and I will say that I waffle and I go back and forth because I'm like, there's nothing new about neoliberalism, except it's also, we can totally see what's new about neoliberalism. So, language is tough.
Thank you. That's a lovely, lovely answer. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, so I think to close this out, I've received another question that I've been asked to read, which asks how you think about the politics of debt relief and when it has been most likely to occur. And the questioner is thinking specifically of two ongoing debates. First, student debt relief, and second, calls for international debt relief that set the US government, private creditors, and other government creditors like China into conflict.
Oh, yeah, I think I feel like we could have a whole other session on the politics of debt relief, and it's really, really important, and I am really for it. And I guess I don't have a theory of when it is more likely to occur, though I could try to think out loud about that. But I guess what I would say is, when I think about this, I do think one of the things that I try to do or think I can do from a historical academic perspective is help people understand the history of how often it has occurred. The US, one of the things that I like about starting with the government selling land to pay off the Revolutionary War debt is it kind of takes us right to the start of the country. And then the government starts issuing credit to try to support the land sales. And there's 24 separate relief acts that are passed around the crisis, leading up to and then after the crises of 1819. There's lots of examples of debt relief happening in US history if we're talking about so much of what's part of the New Deal, of refinancing with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, of government helping to relieve municipal government debts, of the ways that debt relief and credit support can be, credit support is a little different, so I'm gonna take us on another track, but learning these histories can help people understand, this is a thing that happens. It's okay for this to happen. I think we can do a lot more to normalize it and not talk about it as it's unimaginable. It's only from a very particular perspective on the inviolability of property rights that this is a tragic, shocking thing to happen. This is a regular part of economic life, and we can and should be talking about it as one of the things on the table before us, is how I like to think about it. And then also, as we look back on these histories, they're kind of a font of good ideas for other things to do. When Jesse Jones sat down at the RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to talk with the railroads about bailing them out, he demanded personally that the heads of the presidents of the railroads took lower salaries because he thought it was offensive that they were earning those salaries and taking government support. So, there are these lessons that we can take and use as we're thinking about all sorts of credit support and debt relief as a form of credit support.
Oh, thank you. That's a fantastic answer. And actually, I know I said that question would round it out, but I wonder if I could ask your indulgence just to ask one more question myself, which is just actually following up on what you've just said. A question I did want to ask is, over this scope of 200 years that you consider, what are the programs that really stand out as, in your mind, most successful at actually challenging the status quo? Because I completely agree with the assessment that credit markets and especially credit guarantees can very easily reinforce it. I wonder, what stands out to you as the opposite, or pushing furthest in the other direction?
I don't think of it as challenging the status quo, because the successful ones become the status quo and become implicated in all the politics of it.
Mm.
All right, maybe that's not true. Maybe we could say something like the banks for cooperatives, like credit support for cooperative sellers is a, there are ones, but when I'm often thinking of the really big credit programs, like the farm loan system, that does this incredibly important work of providing loans, and then also gets completely wrapped up in all the politics of every, they completely reorganize how U.S. agricultural credit is run and get completely captured and become embroiled in power interests. I mean, you can see there's data on the creation of the FHA, the savings and loans that were early involved in the FHA are the savings and loans that are surviving and doing really well and kind of use it and take over it. So I guess what I would say to that, it was just maybe like not a happy note to end on, but I think the thing is we can think of using credit, and we should be thinking of using credit in these good ways to build a lot of things. And the answer is never going to be, and then make that program and roll it out and it'll be fine. As with any policy, there are going to be feedback loops, there are going to be complications. And one of the things we need to be thinking about is, what does democratic accountability look like in that program? And how are citizens groups going to be able to monitor what's happening in that program over time? What metrics are we using to evaluate the good and the bad that program could be doing, to continually pay attention to over its lifespan?
Well, I have to say, I mean, I disagree in that. I think that's an excellent note to end on, a kind of a call to arms that I imagine will resonate particularly well with the
we have
group that's
Alma
here
over
today.
here. She can help us think about what that might actually look like. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Well, oh, hello. Well, I guess perhaps on that note, we can wind down for today. I just wanted to say in closing that, as I noted at the beginning, this is our last meeting for this year, but we'll certainly be back in 2021. I think on an approximately monthly schedule, and I'll actually be sending out a short feedback form over the email list in the coming days, just to solicit feedback from all of you about how this year's sessions went, things that could be different in the future, and also suggestions for others that you would like to see us invite. So please do be on the lookout for that, and please share your thoughts. And so excited to see you all in 2021. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. I think this was just a spectacular conversation, a huge pleasure for me, and I'm just so grateful. So thank you very, very much.